The art of ornamentation. It could just as easily be called the art of embellishment. These two terms are interchangeable, and what they mean is a device, a technique, a style of writing music or playing music where you add notes to what's already there. Now, this art of ornamentation or embellishment is ancient. It had to go back millennia. If anybody, like the caveman, had a musical instrument that could play two notes, after about a week or two, they'd be really bored, and one of their cave dweller friends would say, "That's boring," and he would try to make it a little bit more interesting by adding a note. This would amuse his colleagues over the campfire for another week or two, and then he'd say, "Well, can't you do more?" And this would go on, and eventually you would have a beautiful ornamented version of this simple tune. And that basically is the art of ornamentation. Decorating, adding things to something that is already beautiful, could be simple. It's not unlike taking a chair, which just has four legs, or a table, even better, and a flat surface, and eventually add some gold leaf, or add some pictures, or put some engraving or marquetry. This is the art of ornamentation, and this lecture will take you on a guided tour of the art of this technique or this style, starting around beginning of what we consider modern music in the 15th century and going all the way to modern times. People were very concerned about ornamenting. It was not easy to do, and it was very important. And I jotted down here that you could see, but I will also read you some of them. Some quotes about ornamentation, so you'll see how very important it was. For example, the great singer and teacher of singing, Bénigne de Bassilly, in his L'Art de bien chanter, Paris, 1668, wrote, "A piece of music can be beautiful and please not, for want of being performed with necessary embellishments, of which embellishments the most part are not marked at all on paper, whether because in fact they cannot be marked for lack of signs for that purpose, or whether it has been considered that too many marks encumber and take away the clearness of a melody, which would bring a kind of confusion." This is basically, I could leave right now. You've just received your instruction on what is good ornamentation. What does it mean? A piece of music won't be beautiful enough unless you embellish it. And you can't write down these embellishments. These should be made up. Otherwise, it would be too awkward. And also, if it's written down, then you play that same thing each time, then it's no longer an embellishment. Everybody seemed to agree. In 1692, the Gentleman's Journal of London wrote, "The counterteller in Purcell's Ode on St. Cecilia's Day was sung, quote, with incredible graces," graces meaning ornaments, and then they added, "by Mr. Purcell himself." So the composer wrote the music, sang the music, and then added notes himself. Charles Burney, an acid-tongued critic in England, wrote, "An adagio in a song or solo is generally little more than an outline." This is another important point. It's an outline, a starting point. You'll see these outlines that we play, and then we will embellish them for you, and you can hear and see how one way one can do them. A little more than an outline left to the performer's abilities to color. If not highly embellished, slow notes soon excite languor, are boring, and disgust in the hearers. Those English critics didn't pull any punches in those days. A fellow Englishman, Roger North, said, "Ornamentation, quote, should never be written out. It is the hardest task that can be to pen right the manner of artificial gracing an upper part. It hath been attempted, and in print, but with woeful effect. The spirit of that art is incommunicable by writing, therefore it is almost inexcusable to attempt it. As I say, the English writers didn't care about being polite. They told you exactly how they felt, and both Charles Burney and Roger North were both absolutely correct. Burney has one final quote. Burney wrote in his General History in 1776, quote, "Purcell, who composed for ignorant and clumsy performers, was obliged to write down some of his fashionable graces and embellishments of the times." So the only time you wrote these embellishments or ornamentation or graces was when you had a bad, clumsy, ignorant performer. So that gives you an idea of what importance embellishment took and how essential it is to performing the music, but also how much fun and how creative it is. Now that I've given you the background of its importance and history, let's look at some specific examples to see how it was done and how it was taught, so that you didn't have to, when you were performing, resort to horrors, written out ornamentation. The first example I choose is by one of the great, great masters of all time, the great Netherlands style, but he was actually French, or he was in Italy a lot, Josquin du Pré. And we're lucky we have an example of his kind of ornamentation, and the quote in this manuscript that we found says, "This is the first embellishment which Josquin taught his own pupils." So this is a primer of lesson number 1. And he gave his students what he called a simple song, a cantus simplex, and he says, and more elegant would be, yes, it is more elegant. If I wanted to do it, if I wanted to be a good Josquin student, I would do it a little bit more excited before I got thrown out of the studio. And I could keep on going. And that's the art of ornamentation. My apologies to Josquin. Let's go a half century or so later, and now we have another great teacher and viola da gambist, the Spanish musician Diego Ortiz, 1510 to 1576. And he wrote pages, a large book called Glosas. And this is how he taught his students. Glosas means ornamentation. So he would give you the basic glosas, which is on the first one, as you see. Now, if I sang or played that again, after the third time, you would say, that's boring. And it was. No one was ever expected to hear or sing it that way. So he gives you, I'm going to just play 6 of the hundreds. Be thankful. I won't play all hundreds of glosas, but play 6 of these to show you what Ortiz would do. It'll start sounding like some 16th century choral music if you're familiar with it. Notice that the last note I raised a half a step to make a leading tone, because that's sort of in the style. Version 2 of another set of glosas by Ortiz. And we can go on. Number 3. And number 4. 5. Here's a 6th one. You get a lot of music, don't you, out of just a few notes. Moving on in the century, another great organist, teacher, and composer, Diruta, of 1546 to 1625. He also did treatise after treatise after treatise, teaching his students and the world at large how to ornament, how to embellish. He called them groppi, or how to improvise divisions. So you can see here, he gives you the basic subject. Now he gives you 2 versions. That's version 1, version 2. If you were a player or a singer and you studied all of these, you would have no problem making a very fancy and very ornamented version of anything you see. Here's subject 2, just one more example. The subject is now descending. And here are 2 ways that Diruta suggested that you do it. And now Diruta suggests yet another way. Moving on in the century, Francesco Regioni. Now you're going to see a little bit more complication now. We're now into the 17th century, more of the modern era. And he calls them different kinds of passaggi, passage work. And he gives you the original. Now, no one wants to hear it that way, but look what he does. His first example is a change not only in notes, but in rhythm into what we call a trochaic pattern and a sort of what is now known as the Scotch snap, but it has nothing to do with Scotland or snapping. That's unusual. Number B. Number C. Here's another one. Another one. Another one. And another one. And another one. And yet one more of many. And there you begin to see what we recognize as the passage work, multi-layered textures. We're just now at the beginning of adding notes on notes on notes. In Bach, for example, here's a famous piece by Bach. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but most young people have played this first of the 2-part inventions. There's a version by Bach. Even Bach himself said, okay, let's add some notes. So this is the beginning of the modern style of music making. Our next example takes us to one of the giants in music history, Claudio Monteverdi, who lived from 1567 to 1643. Truly a giant on the level of Bach and Handel and Brahms and Beethoven. He wrote madrigals, operas, songs, solo songs. And he really changed the course of music history. In fact, I don't want to digress too much, but he sort of invented seconda pratica, and he had big arguments. He took the music away from the standard polyphony of the 16th century, and we made it very much more dramatic and expressing emotion. That's enough of that part, but let's talk about his command of ornamentation or embellishment. The example I have up here is from his first fame and probably most famous, one of his most famous operas, Orfeo. And if you look closely at the score, you'll see two lines, both with the same text. And Possente Spirito. But they're not two singers, it's one singer. And what Monteverdi did was write the basic line, and then he wrote out his own ornamentation. Why? Because it was so important. Why was it so important? The story about this is Orfeo. For those of you who don't know your Greek mythology, is that Orfeo was the greatest musician of all time. He used to, music calms the savage breast or savage beast. He played, the birds dropped out of the trees and just sat and listened. The lion sat by his side. He could sing to everybody, and everybody was mesmerized and thought it was the most sublime thing in the world. Fine. His wife, lover, Eurydice, they loved each other very much, and she gets bitten by a snake and dies and is taken to Hades, hell of Greek times. Orfeo is beside himself, and he decides, I'm going to go down to Hades and get my wife back. Never happened before. And they ask him, how are you going to do it? I'm going to sing my way through it. Because to get into Hades, you had to convince the powerful guardian, the powerful spirit, Possente Spirito, of Coron, and so you can get on his boat and get into Hades, to the god of Hades, Hades himself. And he's going to do it by singing. But an unembellished song is not going to work. And only Orfeo can get his music up to that level that he will seduce Hades and the boatmaster to take him across the river Styx and bring his wife back. So let us now hear that ornamented version, sung by Orfeo, to convince the powers that be, the powerful spirit, Possente, powerful spirit, to let him come in. Please let me come in. And he says no, and then he says, how about if I try to sing some of my best licks? And he does, and he succeeds in getting Eurydice out. He's such a great singer. And I will turn the pages as he sings so you can follow along with the ornamented version. Monteverdi wanted to make sure that the singer would do the best version. Otherwise, he had no chance of getting into hell.
Far passare
it goes on for a while, and Orfeo must have had a lot of breath control down in Hades, and this singer who's singing it now is truly wonderful. And just not to keep you in suspense, as I said, they were so enamored and so convinced by Orfeo's ornamentation that they let Eurydice come back up out of the shades of hell to the light of the earth. But you might know the story. I won't ruin the ending, but I will by telling you the ending, is that he is told not to look back. So he can't look back to see Eurydice come up. He looks back, Eurydice disappears and goes down back to hell for eternity. And no ornamentation is going to help him the second time. So this is the era now of the great virtuoso singers, the absolute, we know of Pavarotti or Adele or Placido Domingo or the great opera singers. Well, the 17th and 18th century had their share as well. And some of the greatest opera singers of the time were the castrati. And the castrati were what they are. They had an operation as a young boy before their voices changed. It's pretty barbaric now, but those that succeeded in having the career, unfortunately many did not, became superstars beyond the likes of any Pavarotti or Adele or any of these famous singers now. They earned the most money. They were adulated. They were just treated as gods. And one of the greatest was named, they always had one name, Farinelli. Now, Farinelli was, as I say, one of the greatest castrati. He made a great career, and and we're going to hear some of Farinelli's ornamentation. There's a movie, by the way, called Farinelli. I don't get any residuals, but it's a pretty good movie about a castrato, fairly recently made. But there's a side story to this. It's very important for harpsichordists or keyboard players. Farinelli was his job. He was hired as the most important musician in the court of Maria Barbara in Madrid. At the same time was the harpsichordist Domenico Scarlatti, who wrote many keyboard, 550 sonatas to be specific, many more actually, but we lost them. And they became very good friends. And after Scarlatti died, and Maria Barbara, I guess, died too, and they got another king and queen, Farinelli decided to go back to Italy. And bless his soul, he said, these sonatas that my friend Domenico Scarlatti wrote are really special. They're beautiful. I'm going to take them with me. And he took them back with him to Italy. If he had not, we would not have Scarlatti sonatas now. But the Spanish court sort of, over the centuries after that, sort of became weaker and dispersed. But Farinelli had saved those sonatas. And when you talk about the sources of Scarlatti sonatas, you talk about the Venice manuscripts and the Parma manuscripts. It's all Italian, thanks to Farinelli. If he had just done that, we should be grateful for him. He also was a great virtuoso singer, and it's from this tradition of castrati, minus the operation, that we get the great divas, the great soloists, the great tenor solos especially. Here's an example of Farinelli, not himself singing, but someone singing Farinelli, a countertenor, and it's from an opera called Merope, 1734, and it's the opening of Quel Usignolo. What a nice nightingale. Now that's a great thing for a singer to sing. And here you'll hear, someone wrote down, if you look closely at the score, someone wrote down how Farinelli ornamented. Well, this castrato, follows Farinelli, and then does some of it on his own. This will give you an example of what was happening on the stage, the opera stage in Europe, in Italy, in England, in Dresden, in Vienna, around this time. You are not going to hear anything straight. Remember back to Diruta and Glossas and all of that good stuff. Here is where it's become part of the musical language. Moving on, just a bit in a few years, we come again to another one of the one of the greatest of composers, George Friedrich Handel. And Handel is a fascinating character. He worked at the Hanover court, and then as a young man, he goes down to Italy, because everybody wanted to go down to Italy to learn how to do music. You notice that all these composers are Italian at this stage. You know, Diruta, Josquin was not Italian, but he thought he was, and Farinelli, and all of these people. And the story goes is that Handel went down, and his biographer said, on his own bottom. And what that really means is that he wasn't sponsored. He paid for it himself, which is very unusual at that time. And he was a huge hit in Italy because he's such a great composer. They called him Il Caro Sassone, the wonderful dear Saxon. And he learned his art of Italian arias and Italian operas from that great Italian tradition. He also, a bit of an aside, he also met Scarlatti down there. and they had a competition, a friendly competition at the Cardinal Ottobone's palazzo, and they played for each other, and the jury said they're both the greatest of ever, but Handel was a better harpsichord composer and Scarlatti was a better organ composer and player. Who knows? But it's a nice story. But it did happen. They did meet. So then Handel comes to England and starts writing, of course, Italian operas. And he writes Italian operas in what style? The style of Farinelli, of Di Ruta, of Monteverdi, very highly ornamented. And he made a big success as an opera composer there, writing Italian operas. He used the famous castrati of that time. They were paid a fortune to come up to England. They also had some real diva sopranos, and there's one famous scene, how important opera was then, that one of them was Fausta Bordoni and the other was Cuzzoni. And they were both divas, and they both happened to appear in the same act, same scene, on the same stage. And they got so, the reports go, they got so angry at each other that they started to hit each other, pull each other's hair, and this is while there's an audience, and they had to be pulled apart. I don't know how apocryphal the story is, but considering how important opera was then, there is a possibility. So here is another example of ornamentation. This is not, Handel did not write this out. It's Handel's crude fuori from his opera, Cruel Furies from the opera Circe. And you won't see any written out on this one now. You'll hear it. And the opera is very highly ornamented by itself. Not ornamented, but lots of notes by itself. And this singer manages on the da capo. What's a da capo? A da capo aria is the composer writes a piece, and we call that the A section. Then there's a small piece, that's the B section. And then he goes back to the A section, and that is the time for the singer to show off and embellish like a crazy man or a crazy woman. Those da capo arias were wonderful vehicles for the singers, for the soloists. So here is a da capo aria, Crude Fuori, by George Frederick Handel.
Aspergetemi, aspergetemi, aspergetemi contro di aspergetemi, crudi funi degli arredi abissi, aspergetemi contro di degli orridi abissi, crude fuori degli orridi abissi, aspergetemi dato di legno, aspergetemi dato di legno, aspergetemi crudi fuori degli orridi abissi. Aspergetemi d'oro vedo. Croni il mondo, e sole se che sì. O quest'ira che spira il mio seno, quest'ira che spera il seno, che spera il seno, nel seno. Crone degli orridi abissi, Volgetevi, rodi fuori dei grido abissini. Aspergetevi,
That was ornamentation. That was glossas with a vengeance, wasn't it? And sometimes I used to hear, nobody does this anymore. They say, well, they didn't sing very well in those days, or they were simple. Well, I think these examples prove what virtuosos they were then, as great, if not greater. In fact, when a singer would sing something like this and then ornament it, chances are the audience would go crazy and then ask for an encore, and she would have to do more ornamentation. Let's hear another example by Handel. Again, even a more florid ornamentation, but another opera. It's called Pena Tirana. It's always about, these ornament arias are always about someone being a tyrant or furious, or a woman being abandoned, or a man killing someone. Otherwise, why ornament? And this is from the opera Amadigi di Gola. This is a countertenor, like a castrato. B section, it's another da capo aria. And you can see the word da capo. He's back to the beginning with ornaments. We've been hearing a lot of vocal music, and rightly so, between the 14th, 15th, and early 16th and early 17th century. It really predominated the musical world. Instrumental music, an independent instrumental music, started to come in around the 17th century, but then it really caught fire and took over much of the musical activities of Europe, of all the great courts. Each court had its own little orchestra or cappella as well. And each instrument began to find its own hero and its own advocate. The violin became exceedingly popular, and the person that made it so popular was the great Arcangelo Corelli. He basically invented a certain style of playing, an Italian style of playing, and also invented the concerto grosso, which eventually becomes concertos. And he, of course, expected, just like the vocal music, his music to be ornamented. There are stories of Corelli playing by himself and playing his own pieces and walking across the stage, leg over leg, as they said, beads of perspiration dropping down his forehead and ending his movement on one knee. So it was that kind of theater. And so we have some examples of Corelli and his sonatas and ornamentation. I'm very pleased that I have to join me the distinguished Baroque violinist, Carol Lieberman, and she will play a number of pieces in this presentation. The first will be a sonata in C major for violin and basso continuo, opus 5, number 3. And we have an example of what is called Corelli's own ornamentation, which is, this is the Rosetta Stone of violin ornamentation. There's some question of authenticity. Some people think it was the publisher saying it was Corelli's ornamentation because it sold more copies. Either way, it's very much in style. So we'll play you a segment of this. I'll put it on the screen for you. There it is. A segment of this sonata. First, the lower line on the violin part is what Corelli wrote first, and the upper part is how he ornamented it. And I'm playing basso continuo, just in case I don't get lost or I can't find my music. And so I'm making up a lot of this as we go along as well, and hopefully I won't get in the way of the soloist, Carol Lieberman. So here's the Sonata number 3 in C major, opus 5, number 3 of Arcangelo Corelli, movement 1. Now, the ornamented version. Now, just because Corelli could write his own ornamentation doesn't mean other great violinists and violin composers couldn't do their own. Not only that, but everything was fair game in this style, in this period of the Baroque ornamentation, in the ornamented Baroque style. And so many great violinist composers took Corelli's sonatas and made their own ornamentations of Corelli. And not only was this not rude and not illegal, flattery is they say? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So we're very lucky to have here a whole bunch of versions of another Corelli sonata. This one, Opus 5, number 9. And if you look at the screen in front of you, you'll see all kinds of composers taking a different view of Corelli's original music, making it their own ornamentation. We will play you 3 of these. First, on the bottom is Corelli's original, which we will play. And then we'll give a version by Gemignani, another one of the great Italian violinists. And then by Tartini, yet another one of the great violinists a little later. And then further down, Dubourg. Now, Dubourg was Handel's favorite violinist. But again, they're always ornamenting in the Italian style. What are the greatest violin makers from the 17th and 18th century? Italian, of course. Who were the greatest violinists from the 17th and 18th century? Italian. And until things changed in the 19th century. So here is another Corelli sonata, Opus 5, number 9. First the original, and then 3 different versions: Gemignani, Tartini, and Dubourg. Keyboard music was also ornamented. I've shown you a little bit about that when I was playing my basso continuo line, but everybody had to get in the act and change things around. Again, so often during this wonderful period of creativity, the score, the printed music, was just a starting point. And I have an example of this. There's not so much ornamentation, but very instructive in how people treated basic music and how it was really played. On this sheet, you'll see 2 pieces. One is, on top, is a toccata in A minor, a couple of measures by Johann Jakob Froberger. I will play that first of all, exactly as it's written. that's all very nice, but poor old Froberger would be rolling over in his grave because he never expected to be played that way. He would expect something like this. Now, that's better. We are fortunate, however, to also have another piece by a very close friend of his and a contemporary, Louis Couperin. And they really admired and liked each other. And when Froberger came to Paris to visit Louis Couperin in the middle of the 17th century, he obviously played this piece for him because Couperin wrote his own version called Prelude in imitation of Mr. Froberger. Now, if you look at this music on below, you say, this is very strange. Did he forget to put in measure numbers and bar lines? No. These are called whole note or free unmeasured preludes. And you can play them rather freely. But this is his version, a free version of his friend Froberger's Toccata in A minor. So this gives us an idea of how it was really happening. So ladies and gentlemen, keyboard players, boys and girls, children of all ages, seriously, when you see music like this, don't play it so straight as is written. It's not in the spirit, and it's not very interesting, and it is not very creative. Try some things, arpeggiate, add notes. Maybe you'll make a mistake here and there, but the chances are you will definitely be really honoring the composer's intentions. The French of the 18th century, late 17th, early 18th century, like everything else, if you think of Louis XIV and the court of Versailles, everything else was so organized and regulated and beautiful and decorated, and you don't mess around with the King Louis XIV, the Sun King. You did it the way he wanted. Those were the rules. So they started to write these tables of ornaments. So make sure people at least put the ornaments in correctly and put the right ornaments. So if you look at this example, this is by a composer called Danglebert. You can see, and I'll play a few of them, not all of them, too boring. The first one is called the Tremblement Simple, simple trill. The second one is a Tremblement Appuyé. Are you writing this down? I hope not. And this is when you hold the note a little bit. Here's what he calls a cadence, which is a turn before the trill. Here's another autre, a different kind of cadence. Here's a double cadence. And etc., etc., etc. There's a pincée. This is the second line, first ornament. Pincée means pinch, and so forth. And they had so many of them. A few years later comes François Couperin. He never was known after a while as François Couperin. He was known as François Couperin le Grand, the Great One, and he was. And you can see, I won't play, here are all of his ornaments. There are more pages, but this is a picture of his explication des agréments, explanation of agréments or ornaments, and the signs that are used to show them. They were all over the place. And they were very important to him. I will show you why. Here is a piece by François Couperin called L'Enfantine, the infant. And look at those ornaments, all of them. It's like, Again, our dear friend Charles Burney, if you remember him from his nasty comments about writing out ornaments, he once wrote a review of François Couperin, and he said, quote, "François Couperin is a great composer, but his pieces are so marred, ruined by all manner of ornaments. He didn't like this ornamented style. But they are so important to this style. I will show you how important they are. I will play a part of this delightful melody piece, the first half, without ornaments, and see what you think. It's not unlike that Faubourg I told you about." Now, that's very nice, sort of silly and simple. Not anything what Couperin wanted. What Couperin wanted, he wrote. He told you exactly. This is not like the Corelli. He said, "Go for it, guys." Here, what he puts in is and I'm going to give you each one. You don't have to show you, and then I'll play the piece for you. He puts a pincée, what we know as a mordant, on the first note. Then he puts a tremblement appuyé, pushed aside. Finally, a note without an ornament. Another tremblement, a trill or trembler. Then a porte de voix with a pincée, which is a accented passing note or appoggiatura. And another tremblement, and another porte de voix and pincée. You don't have to remember this, but I just show you how many there are here. Another tremblement appuyé, push aside. Another note without an ornament. Be thankful for small favors. And then another tremblement. Now another porte de voix, appoggiatura and pincée. And another pincée. And that little thing above that note that you see is called a suspension. And you play it a little bit after the beat, and so forth. So, that's a very quick way of just telling you what those 4.5 measures have. Every of his pieces has ornaments like this. I will play the piece again for you without ornaments. And now, as Couperin wrote it, and he insisted you play it this way. Better, don't you think? That's an interesting piece of music. I'll do it again. That's why he was called Le Grand. Without those ornaments, we'll call him Le Petit. Here is another piece by François Couperin, even more ornamented. It is a courante, a dance, from Book 1 of his order, and I have someone playing it for you because it's a beautiful performance on a beautiful harpsichord. And what he does, not only does he write a piece of music with so many ornaments, then he says, oh, that's not enough. And he writes a double. He calls it double plus orné without changing the bass, which means double, even more ornamented, plus orné, without changing the bass. So you'll hear this. If you look, and the ornamented version is down below, so you'll hear the first half, then the ornamented version, the second half, the ornamented version. Now the ornamented version. basic version. The double. When I was recording all the works of Francois Couperin, one engineer said, "That's a lot of ornaments. Are there any pieces without ornaments?" And I said, "No, maybe one or two notes." Now that's what Bernie didn't like, but it makes the harpsichord sound so better, much better, and so much fuller. And it's the style. Just think, if you can imagine a table of the French style of the 18th century. It's not straight up and down. It's all gold leaf and curly Q, just like their music. So what about ornamenting Bach? Didn't he write enough notes? Some people are horrified if you suggest adding notes to Bach. How do you add notes to perfection? It's like adding notes to the Bible. And one person said that ornamenting Bach reminds me of pigeon droppings on great statues. And the fact is, as I showed you at the beginning of this lecture, Bach loved ornamentation just as anybody else. He used it differently, but he knew how to ornament and he used it. In his book for his little boy, Wilhelm Friedrich Bach, that table of ornaments that I showed you from Dongelbeer, he put that table inside his little Klavierbüchlein, the little keyboard book for Wilhelm Friedrich Bach when he was 8 years old. So we have an example of Bach ornamenting, in fact doing exactly what Couperin did. It's a sarabande from the English suite, and first you'll hear the sarabande, and then you'll hear what he calls les agréments de la même sarabande, the ornamentation or the ornaments for the same sarabande. Now here comes Bach's double. We continue with Bach now, and Bach loved all kinds of music. As you can see, he loved French music. Whenever Bach took a piece of music from another style, like French or English or Italian, he always seemed to make it better, didn't he? Yes, he did, and more complicated. And Bach loved the Italian violinist. He was a little bit older and didn't know Corelli as well, but he did know Vivaldi. He was a big fan of Vivaldi, and he actually brought a lot of Vivaldi back to his Duke when he was serving as Kapellmeister in Weimar as a young man. And he took a number of Vivaldi's famous violin concertos and he turned them into concertos for solo harpsichord. Here's one example. This is a violin concerto in G minor, Opus 4, number 6 by Vivaldi, which we'll play. It's on top. Carol Lieberman will play it. And then it's the second movement, and let's see what Bach does about Italian style, not French now, Italian style ornamentation. And here is how Bach ornamented Vivaldi. Another great example of Bach using Italian ornamentation comes from, of all things, his Italian concerto, BWV 971, such a famous piece. People who have played it or have heard it know it's very familiar, it's gorgeous. And what that is an ornamented version of Bach's own non-existent Italian violin concerto. I've made a version of that non-existent violin concerto so you can hear where it comes from. Just like the Vivaldi, and here it is Bach's version. The art of ornamentation, of embellishment, refused to die. In fact, it didn't die. And we have examples into the late 18th and throughout the middle of the 19th century. Mozart was a master improviser and ornamenter. If anybody saw the movie Amadeus, which had some wonderful scenes of the young Mozart improvising, ornamenting a piece by Salieri, you'll get a sense of what he could do. This is a piece by a composer, he was a Bohemian composer who ended up in Germany, Franz Benda. And he was so excited or so interested or so didactic about ornamentation that he wrote these pieces called sonatas for violin and continuo, but with varied reprises. And not only did he have one reprise, but he did two. So what Ms. Lieberman will play is the top part as written, then the second line and the third line, all slightly different, all slightly ornamented by the same composer. as we move into the 19th century, as I mentioned, the art of ornamentation slowly but surely starts to disappear from the musical scene. Why is that? Well, music becomes more complicated, but that's no excuse. But also there's a shift that changes between the relationship of performer and composer. For one thing, before the 19th century, there was no distinction. The performer was the composer was the performer. This was true in the early 19th century as well, but gradually composers started writing music, what I call roadmaps, with all kinds of instructions and treating performers like sort of trained monkeys. You know, a forte here, a piano here, slower here, faster here, you know, pedal here, and none of that. It was the nature of the beast, the nature of the music, the nature of the society, and all kinds of other factors we won't get into. But some composers never lost their love and taste and knowledge of ornamentation. And one of them was Frédéric Chopin. And all that wonderful music that he wrote, which has such florid bel canto melodic lines in the right hand that drove a lot of pianists crazy trying to play them all, were really just his own version of ornamented lines, just like you heard in the Bach Vivaldi I played you, just like you heard in that Couperin with the doubles, all of this going way back. Very much more complicated, but if you listen carefully to this nocturne, you will, and try to imagine, like I did with the Italian concerto, try to imagine the original in Chopin's mind that didn't exist, and how this is one of his ornamented versions. Here is Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9, number 1 in B-flat minor. It's not a stretch that you could hear some of Couperin's porte-voix and tremblement, the trills, a lot more notes, but there's a simple melodic bel canto line hiding behind all that frilly ornamentation. Speaking of bel canto, the other advance or the other step forward in ornamentation happened with Rossini. Now, remember all that ornamentation, the Handel and the Farinelli, and brilliant ornamentation by that singer. Well, Rossini was doing the same thing. He just happened to write out every note of ornamentation. And that's why the bel canto style, the virtuoso bel canto style, is so brilliant and so hard to sing. Fortunately, we have one of the great divas of all time in the coloratura Rossini style, Beverly Sills, and here's a brief excerpt of not only her skill, but Rossini's brilliance in vocal writing, but also his sense of humor. He was a very funny guy, and just so you might know, he was also one of the laziest composers in history. He would put off writing an opera till 2 weeks before it was due and then write it. And there's another story, maybe apocryphal, that he was wrapped up in his blankets, it was very cold, and he was writing an overture, and it blew out of his hands and onto the floor. And rather than get out of the covers, he simply took another piece of paper and wrote another overture. But here is Rossini's coloratura, meaning ornamentation. He didn't know who Diruta was, he didn't know who Ortiz was, but he knew how to write ornamentation. Brilliant ornamentation. Our last example, as I said, so as the 19th century progresses, music becomes more complicated. Composers write more and more instructions on what we need to do. And by the 20th century, especially with 12-tone music and its incredible complexities, you can't have when you have 12-tone music, you can ornament, but the rules are to stay within the 12 tones if you know that style. And you certainly can't have a violin section ornamenting in a Mahler symphony. Then chaos would exist. So the art of ornamentation until the Baroque revival really begins to step back into the shadows, except for one place where ornamentation, embellishment, and improvisation are part of the core aspect of the art. And that's jazz. And jazz has kept on that tradition of ornamenting in their own special style. In the old days, you could ornament in the French style, into the Italian style, the German style, and these, they ornamented in Miles Davis style, Thelonious Monk style, Louis Armstrong style, New Orleans style. And here's a very good example of a jazz group, and you'll hear the marimba play a very ornamented version already. It's a long piece, they go on for a long time, and then the double bass picks it up, which is just what would happen in the Baroque era, copying and ornamenting. And this is John Lewis, and a famous jazz artist, and this recording is from the Zagreb Jazz Quartet. Piano takes over as well. And that was what would happen if you had a trio sonata, which means, like, let's say there's a violinist and a flutist and a harpsichordist. The violinist would start ornamenting. The flute would just hear that and say, I could do that. I could do it better. And the flutist takes over, and then the harpsichordist starts imitating them all, as I was doing in this last piece. And you have a creative meeting of the minds, so to speak. That's why they often called chamber music in the old days, in German, Unterhaltung, a conversation between musicians. So this gives you a 500-year history of Baroque, musical ornamentation and embellishment in a nutshell. And you could see the similarities and whether it was French or Italian or different kinds of approaches. But I leave this lecture with a closing thought. Do it. Ornament if you're playing music. You've learned how from this, perhaps, but it's not difficult. It doesn't take much if you have a note that goes like this. To say, I can do this, or, and the permutations and the possibilities are endless, and it will make your musical experience and the audience's music experience that much more enriching and might even make them smile. Thank you.